What is it exactly that disappears when an airplane vanishes? Not only metal, fuel, and human lives, though those losses are unbearable enough. Something else goes missing too. Certainty, the quiet faith that the world is ordered, measured, and knowable. The belief that a machine can leave one city, cross a mapped sky, and arrive where it was meant to go. For more than a century, flight has symbolized mastery over distance. And yet, again and again, the sky has reminded us that mastery is never complete. There is a particular loneliness to aviation mysteries. A ship may leave splinters on the water. A train leaves tracks. Even a ruined city leaves stone behind. But an aircraft can enter cloud, darkness, or a stretch of open sea and seem to pass from the visible world into a silence too large for language. Families wait at terminals. Radios remain still. Search crews sweep enormous distances. And then the strangest fact of all begins to settle in. Sometimes there is almost nothing to find. This story is not about easy answers. It is not about turning uncertainty into spectacle or dressing grief in the costume of legend. It is about the uneasy border between what we know and what we only think we know. Across decades, from propeller aircraft crossing wartime oceans to modern jets guided by satellites and software, there have been flights that simply slipped beyond explanation. Some carried soldiers. Some carried tourists, workers, children, and pilots on ordinary routes. All of them began in the most human way possible, with an itinerary, a departure time, and the expectation of arrival. What follows is a journey through those absences, through radar gaps, unfinished radio calls, scattered debris, and sometimes not even that, through official reports that end with cautious language, and loved ones who are left to build meaning from fragments. These disappearances invite technical questions, certainly, but they also ask something older and more intimate. How do we live with the parts of reality that refuse to resolve? And why does the open sky, even now, still carry corners of darkness we cannot fully name? What happens when a horizon stops making sense? On a December afternoon in 1945, the Atlantic off Florida looked ordinary enough. Pale winter light, a manageable sea, a training route so familiar, it barely seemed to deserve the name adventure. 5 Navy bombers lifted from Fort Lauderdale in formation, their engines steady, their assignment routine. They were young men in a world just emerging from war, practicing the mathematics of distance, direction, and return. For a while, everything held. Then the radios began to change in tone. The voice of the flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, no longer sounded certain. His compasses, he said, were failing. Landmarks no longer matched expectation. The ocean itself seemed unfamiliar, as though the map in his mind had slid a few inches out of place. Other pilots questioned him, offered alternatives, tried to reassemble order from fragments of radio static. But confusion has its own momentum. Once doubt enters a cockpit, every instrument becomes suspect, every decision heavier than the last. As daylight thinned, the squadron drifted deeper into uncertainty. Fuel was falling, instructions overlapped. Somewhere below them were the Bahamas, or perhaps the Keys, or perhaps only open water repeating itself in every direction. One pilot reportedly said that even the sea did not look right. It is one of the most haunting phrases in aviation history, not because it proves anything unusual, but because it captures a deeply human terror. The moment the world no longer confirms what your senses are trying to tell you. Then the radios went quiet. The search that followed only deepened the wound. Another aircraft launched to find them disappeared as well, and the sky offered back almost nothing. No wreckage to study, no final position to fix, no clean ending for the families waiting at home. Flight 19 would become legend, folded into myths about triangles and anomalies. But beneath all that is something more sobering. Even trained men flying together can arrive at the edge of uncertainty and find that discipline is not always enough. Sometimes the oldest fear is also the simplest, to be lost and to know it. How can something so large vanish in an age that measures everything? In the early hours of March 8, 2014, a Malaysia Airlines jet lifted into the night from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing with 239 people on board. It was a Boeing 777, a machine built in the language of modern confidence, redundant systems, global tracking, international corridors, A world stitched together by radar and satellites. Nothing about its departure suggested legend. It was simply another overnight flight carrying lives in motion. Then, less than an hour later, the ordinary began to fracture. The final voice from the cockpit was calm, almost tender in its routine. Good night. Soon after, the aircraft vanished from civilian radar. Not destroyed in full view, not claimed by weather, not accompanied by a cry for help. It simply slipped from one system of certainty into another darker realm of possibility. Later, military data and faint satellite handshakes suggested that the plane had turned away from its path and continued flying for hours, as if guided by intention or by some failure too precise to name. The world responded with extraordinary force. Nations shared maps, ships crossed immense distances, analysts examined data pixel by pixel, and families waited inside a grief made worse by ambiguity. Debris eventually reached faraway shores, washed up like broken punctuation from a sentence no one could finish. But the aircraft itself, its recorders, its final interior truth, remained out of reach. What happened in those hours has been debated through every available framework: mechanical breakdown, hijacking, pilot action, system failure, human despair. Each theory explains something. None explains everything. And that may be why this disappearance unsettled people so deeply. It was not only the loss of life, though that remains central and irreparable. It was the realization that even now, in a century of signals and surveillance, a passenger jet can still pass beyond the edge of explanation. We build networks to defeat distance. We trust them to hold. But sometimes the sky reminds us that information is not the same thing as understanding. What can a single radio call carry across the dark? In 1937, Amelia Earhart was already more than an aviator. She had become an emblem of motion itself, of modern courage, of women stepping into spaces long reserved for men, of a century convinced that the globe could be crossed by nerve and engineering. When she and navigator Fred Noonan set out to fly around the world, the journey seemed to gather all those meanings into one fragile aircraft. By the time they approached the Central Pacific, the flight had become a contest not just of skill, but of precision. The ocean below offered almost no visual mercy. Small errors in navigation could become enormous in consequence. Earhart's destination, Howland Island, was little more than a sliver in a vast blue field. A U.S. Coast Guard cutter waited nearby, transmitting signals, listening for her voice, trying to turn geography into something survivable. But the exchange that followed was full of strain, signals heard imperfectly, bearings unclear, fuel becoming a silent pressure inside every sentence. Her last known messages remain among the most haunting in aviation. She reported flying on a line, running north and south, trying to find what should have been there. One can almost hear the tightening circle of thought in those words. The map says the island exists, the instruments say one thing, the sky says another. Then the connection failed. The plane did not arrive. Search efforts swept the ocean on a scale unprecedented for the time. Yet the sea kept its answer. In the decades since, theories have multiplied. Crash at sea, landfall on a remote island, signals misread, evidence misidentified. Earhart's disappearance became a cultural mirror, reflecting whatever each era most wanted to believe about mystery, heroism, and unfinished stories. But beneath the speculation is a quieter truth. She was not trying to become myth in those final hours. She was trying to locate a strip of land, conserve fuel, trust her instruments, and survive. Perhaps that is why her loss endures. It reminds us that history's most luminous figures remain human at the point of greatest uncertainty. Fame cannot negotiate with distance. Courage cannot command the horizon. And sometimes the line between triumph and disappearance is no wider than an island no one can see. Can a lake keep secrets like an ocean? On a summer night in 1950, the waters of Lake Michigan lay dark and deceptively familiar, bordered by towns, harbors, in the reassuring geometry of the American Midwest. Northwest Orient Flight 2501 had left New York and was heading west toward Minneapolis and then Seattle, carrying 58 people across a route that should have felt domestic, ordinary, contained. This was not a lonely stretch of the Pacific, it was inland America, a place people believed they understood. Near midnight, as the aircraft approached weather over the lake, the pilot requested permission to descend. It was the kind of communication that barely disturbs the rhythm of air travel, practical, calm, unremarkable. Then the radio went silent. No distress call followed, no last burst of urgency. The plane, a sturdy Douglas DC-4, simply fell out of the conversation between sky and ground. Search crews moved quickly, certain that some evidence would surface. A crash in a lake, after all, should leave a trail. But the trail was strangely thin. Fragments appeared. So did human remains. Yet the body of the aircraft itself seemed to dissolve into cold depth and distance. Divers searched. Sonar swept the lakebed. Years turned into decades. And still the central fact remained elusive. The main wreckage was never conclusively recovered. For families, that absence created a second loss. Without the wreck, there could be no final reconstruction, no complete account of the last moments, no satisfying line between event and explanation. Storms were present that night, and weather has long seemed the most reasonable answer. But reason does not always quiet the imagination. Reports of unusual radio interference, sudden static, and the peculiar difficulty of locating the aircraft gave the story another texture, one less dramatic than myth, but perhaps more unsettling, not supernatural, simply incomplete, a reminder that even over familiar water, systems fail, signals vanish, and accidents can refuse to arrange themselves into a neat human narrative. Maybe that is what makes this case linger. We expect mystery from distant oceans and wartime frontiers. We do not expect it from a lake bordered by home. Yet disappearance does not always choose the remote or exotic. Sometimes it occurs close to shore, close to certainty, in places we think have already surrendered all their unknowns. And perhaps that is the deeper unease. Not that the world is full of darkness, but that darkness can survive inside the map. What does it mean to vanish between one shore and another? In January 1948, a British South American Airways airliner called Star Tiger left the Azores and turned toward Bermuda, carrying passengers and crew across a stretch of Atlantic air that had already begun to acquire an uneasy reputation. Yet there was nothing mythical about the flight itself. It was a Tudor forewar, part of the post-war promise that distant places could be joined by schedule and machine, that the chaos of the previous decade might give way to a more orderly world. But the crossing was not gentle. The aircraft faced strong headwinds and flew lower than usual, a practical decision that came with its own burdens. Low altitude meant less margin, less room for error, and a closer intimacy with weather that was never entirely predictable. Even so, the communications from the cockpit did not suggest crisis. The crew reported their position. They gave updated estimates. The language remained composed, technical, unalarmed. Then, somewhere before dawn, the conversation simply ended. No distress call was heard. No wreckage was found. Search aircraft and ships combed the ocean over vast distances, tracing routes and probabilities. But the Atlantic kept its silence. The official inquiry could not identify a single definitive cause. Investigators considered navigation error, weather, fuel concerns, mechanical failure, and the limitations of the aircraft itself. Each possibility had weight. None could be proven. In the absence of evidence, the disappearance began to drift into the wider folklore of the sea and sky, and yet the enduring power of Star Tiger lies not in legend, but in its restraint. There was no dramatic final message, no obvious catastrophe witnessed from below, no image to fix the event in public memory. Only an aircraft moving steadily through darkness, a chain of ordinary reports, and then an emptiness where the next transmission should have been. It is this quietness that makes the story feel so modern. Disaster does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as a break in continuity, a missing sentence in an otherwise familiar page. Perhaps that is why these mid-century disappearances still haunt us. They belong to an era of growing confidence, when technology seemed ready to tame distance for good. But the Atlantic had other lessons. It reminded a generation that progress does not erase vulnerability, it only changes the shape of it. And between departure and arrival, there remains a space where human plans, however careful, can still come undone without leaving a clear explanation behind. What remains when even the search becomes part of the mystery? Less than a year after Star Tiger disappeared, another British South American Airways aircraft entered the same uneasy corridor of sky. In January 1949, Star Ariel departed Bermuda for Kingston, Jamaica, under conditions that, at first glance, seemed almost ideal. The weather was clear, visibility was good, the aircraft, another 2 to 4 lifted into a bright morning rather than a storm-filled night. If Star Tiger had vanished amid headwinds and darkness, this flight seemed protected by daylight and calm. Its first transmissions reinforced that impression. The crew reported altitude and position in a routine, professional rhythm. Nothing in those messages suggested urgency. There were no signs of turbulence severe enough to threaten the aircraft, no distress signal, no hint of fire or structural emergency. And then, with almost insulting abruptness, the radio traffic ended. Not faded. Ended. The plane failed to make its next report, and the Caribbean, like the Atlantic before it, became a field of absence. The search was immediate and extensive. Aircraft scanned the sea lanes. Ships moved across likely routes. Investigators worked through the facts available to them, trying to force some pattern from the silence. But Star Ariel left almost nothing behind. No confirmed debris field. No floating wreckage that could anchor the imagination in physical reality. Only the knowledge that an airliner full of people had been present in the world one moment and unaccounted for the next. Because the weather had been favorable, the disappearance felt harder to absorb. Bad weather offers a kind of narrative comfort. It gives us something to point to, a visible adversary. Clear skies remove that comfort. They remind us that many failures begin invisibly, inside wiring, inside instruments, inside the fragile chain of assumptions that makes flight possible. The official conclusions remain cautious, unable to determine a cause with certainty. In that restraint, there is a kind of honesty. Sometimes investigation reaches its limit, not because effort was lacking, but because evidence itself has gone missing. Star Ariel deepened a troubling pattern. 2 aircraft from the same airline, same aircraft type, same broad region, both swallowed without a final answer. But beyond the pattern lies a more human thought. We often imagine mystery as something theatrical, marked by storm clouds or warnings. Yet some of the most enduring mysteries begin under open skies. They begin on ordinary mornings in level light when the world appears calm enough to trust. And perhaps that is why they stay with us. They suggest that uncertainty does not always arrive looking like danger. Sometimes it wears the face of a beautiful day. What if the strangest aviation mystery is not a crash, but a departure? At sunset on May 25, 2003, in Luanda, Angola, a Boeing 727 sat on the runway like a relic from another era, large, aging, and seemingly out of place in the modern world. It had once belonged to American Airlines, then passed into cargo service, then into a kind of limbo. It had not flown in many months. To most people at the airport, it was no longer a living machine, it was a leftover, and then it moved. Without an approved flight plan, without radio contact, and without broadcasting a transponder signal, the aircraft began to taxi. Witnesses later recalled a takeoff that looked awkward, even improvised, as though the person at the controls was not entirely fluent in the airplane's language. That detail only sharpened the mystery. A Boeing 727 was not a plane one simply borrowed. It was a heavy jet built for crews, procedures, checklists, and coordination. Yet it rolled onto the runway, accelerated into the dusk, lifted westward over the Atlantic, and disappeared. And investigators soon focused on 2 men believed to be connected to the aircraft. One had aviation maintenance experience and a pilot's license, though not the certification typically required to command a 727. The other had no known qualifications to fly such a machine at all. That raised a troubling question. If they were aboard, how did they manage the takeoff? And if they were not, then who was? The plane had enough fuel to reach a number of possible destinations across Africa or beyond, but no confirmed landing was ever recorded. No verified wreckage surfaced. No airport acknowledged its arrival. For a time, the disappearance drew fears far larger than theft. This was the early 21st century, when the image of a stolen airliner carried its own cold echo. Intelligence agencies watched. Airfields were checked. Rumors spread across continents. Some believed the plane had crashed into remote terrain or the sea. Others suspected it had been hidden, repainted, dismantled, or absorbed into black market aviation. None of those possibilities were ever proven. What lingers is not just the absence of the aircraft, but the audacity of the silence around it. A jetliner is not a coin slipping through a crack in the floor. It leaves paperwork, witnesses, radar traces, logistical consequences. Or at least it should. Yet this one seemed to find a gap in the world wide enough to pass through. Perhaps that is why the story unsettles in a different way than the others. It suggests that disappearance is not always born of storm, error, or mechanical failure. Sometimes it may begin with intention, with someone deciding not to be where the world expects them to be. And in that choice lies another kind of mystery. Not what the sky can hide, but what human beings can hide inside the ordinary machinery of modern life. What do we do with the last words that never reach their destination? On June 2, 2009, Air France Flight 447 departed Rio de Janeiro for Paris, carrying 228 people overnight across the Atlantic. It was a route flown many times before, the sort of long-haul journey modern aviation had made almost mundane. Passengers settled into sleep, cabin lights dimmed, and the aircraft moved north through darkness toward Europe. For those on board, the night was meant to be a bridge between continents, a pause between one life moment and the next. Somewhere over the equatorial Atlantic, that bridge gave way. The aircraft, an Airbus A330, encountered a region of turbulent weather and high-altitude icing. Automatic messages began transmitting from the plane, brief, sterile fault reports sent not as cries for help, but as system alerts, tiny electronic fragments that would later become crucial. Then the aircraft disappeared from radar contact. There was no complete spoken narrative from the cockpit to carry the world through the event in real time. Only silence, then absence. At first, uncertainty spread in widening circles. Search teams scanned the ocean. Families waited for news that kept shifting between hope and dread. Debris was eventually found, but the deeper truth remained locked beneath thousands of meters of water. For nearly 2 years, the flight recorders rested on the ocean floor before they were finally recovered. When investigators pieced together the final minutes, the explanation was both technical and profoundly human. Ice crystals had obstructed the pitot tubes, temporarily confusing speed readings. The autopilot disconnected. In the confusion that followed, the pilots, facing contradictory cues, darkness, stress, and only seconds to interpret a failing situation, lost control of the aircraft. There was no single monstrous cause, no villain large enough to hold the whole tragedy. Instead, there was a chain: weather, design limits, training gaps, cognitive overload, the terrible speed at which modern systems can shift responsibility back to human hands. Flight 447 became one of the clearest examples of how disaster can emerge not from mystery alone, but from the interaction between people and machines at the edge of comprehension. And yet, even with the recorders recovered, even with the data laid out, a residue of sorrow remains that analysis cannot dissolve, because explanation is not the same as consolation. We may understand more now than we did in those first days of searching. We may even point to lessons learned and procedures changed, but the deeper question survives. In moments when technology falters, what do we really ask of human beings? Perfect interpretation, instant wisdom, calm beyond fear. Flight 447 reminds us that knowledge can arrive late, and when it does, it often reveals not just what failed, but how fragile our confidence has always been. How can a mountain keep a secret in plain sight? In 1972, a small chartered plane carrying a Uruguayan rugby team, along with friends and family, crossed into the Andes under the false comfort of routine. The aircraft was not meant to become legend. It was simply transporting young people toward a match, toward laughter, toward a future imagined in the ordinary language of plans. But the Andes are not ordinary. They rise like a wall between intentions and outcomes, beautiful from a distance and brutally indifferent up close. Clouds closed in. Navigation grew uncertain. The pilots believed they had cleared the mountains when in fact they had not. What followed was sudden and catastrophic. The Fairchild aircraft struck the peaks and broke apart, leaving a section of fuselage stranded high in a frozen white emptiness. Some died instantly. Others woke into a silence so complete it must have felt unreal, as if the world below had been erased and only snow, wind, and pain remained. Search planes passed overhead, but the wreckage blended into the landscape. In time, the official search was suspended. To the outside world, they were gone. What happened next has often been reduced to its most shocking detail, but that is too small a way to tell it. The true story is not merely about survival under impossible conditions. It is about the slow reassembly of human will in a place that offered almost nothing. The survivors improvised shelter from broken metal, rationed scraps, endured avalanches, buried friends, argued, prayed, despaired, and began again each morning because morning had come. Hunger forced choices that still disturb and divide people who hear them. Yet those choices emerged not from savagery, but from the desperate mathematics of staying alive one more day. Eventually, after more than 2 months, two survivors crossed the mountains on foot and found help. Rescue came not as miracle, but as the final reward of exhausted human determination. The world greeted the story with awe, discomfort, judgment, compassion, sometimes all at once. Yet beneath every reaction lies a more enduring question. What is a person really when stripped of comfort, custom, and certainty? The Andes answered with something severe but clarifying. Human beings are more breakable than they imagine, and far more resilient than they know. And sometimes survival itself becomes a form of testimony spoken on behalf of those who could not return. What if the evidence arrives, but the certainty never does? On July 24, 1948, a commercial seaplane called the Stardust left Buenos Aires for Santiago, carrying passengers across one of the world's most formidable natural barriers. The Andes, even in clear weather, can humble both machine and map. Peaks rise like illusions, distances deceive, air currents twist without warning. To cross them safely in the mid-20th century required skill, calculation, and a trust in instruments that could not always account for the moods of high mountains. At first, the flight seemed to proceed normally. Then came one of the most famous final messages in aviation history, a cryptic Morse code transmission ending with the letters Stendek. The message was repeated, received, and never fully understood. It became an instant riddle. Was it a coding error, a garbled phrase, a final attempt to communicate something urgent through failing conditions? Whatever it meant, it was followed by silence. The aircraft did not arrive in Santiago. Search teams scoured the Andes, but the mountains offered back no visible answer. And so the mystery hardened over time. Without wreckage, speculation rushed in to fill the void. Some imagined sabotage. Others favored navigational error, hidden weather, disorientation, or a misjudged descent. But the most powerful ingredient in the story was that strange final word, hanging in the air like a fragment from another language. It transformed an accident into an obsession. For decades, the plane seemed less lost than absorbed, taken into snow, stone, and myth. Then, in 1998, the mountain began to loosen its grip. Melting ice on a glacier revealed wreckage, human remains, and pieces of the aircraft long preserved in frozen silence. Investigators concluded that the plane had likely descended too early, deceived by strong tailwinds that made the crew believe they had crossed the Andes sooner than they actually had. The mountain was there before them, unseen until it was too late. In practical terms, the mystery had an answer. In emotional terms, it remained larger than that. Because the meaning of Stardust was never only about how the aircraft crashed. It was about the long delay between loss and understanding, about how nature can keep truth intact while withholding it from us for half a century, and about the way a single unresolved detail, a word without clear meaning, can keep a story alive in the human imagination. Perhaps that is the lesson the mountain leaves us. Not every mystery is permanent. Some are simply waiting beneath the ice until time itself decides to speak. How does an aircraft carrying 100 people leave behind not even a fragment of farewell? On March 16, 1962, a flying Tiger Line Super Constellation rose from Guam into calm Pacific air, carrying U.S. soldiers and crew toward the Philippines on what should have been a straightforward military charter. It was the sort of flight that disappears in plain administrative language. Manifest numbers, fuel calculations, route clearances, expected arrival times. Yet behind those dry details were young men traveling toward an uncertain war, suspended in that brief space between home and history. For a time, the flight seemed perfectly ordinary. The aircraft reached cruising altitude. Communication remained routine. Weather offered no obvious threat. Then, somewhere over the Pacific, the chain of contact broke. No distress call came. No emergency beacon sounded. The radio did not fill with panic or confusion. It simply stopped speaking. In the hours that followed, military forces launched a vast search over an enormous stretch of ocean. Aircraft swept the sea. Ships scanned the route. Investigators waited for the smallest sign. Oil, wreckage, a life raft, anything that might transform disappearance into an event that could at least be named. Almost nothing came. One detail, however, lingered like a match struck in darkness. A ship in the area reported seeing a bright flash high in the sky, followed by glowing trails descending toward the water. It sounded, to some ears, like an explosion. To others, it was only an uncertain observation in a place already ruled by distance and ambiguity. Official explanations never settled comfortably around that testimony. Sabotage was considered, then drifted away for lack of evidence. Mechanical failure remained possible but unproven. Collision seemed unlikely. The ocean, once again, kept the central fact beyond reach. What makes this disappearance so unsettling is not only the scale of the loss, but the administrative emptiness that followed. Families were given fragments, not answers. Public statements remained guarded. Over time, some wondered whether the mission involved more than transport, whether the cargo of the flight included knowledge or personnel too sensitive to discuss openly. That idea has never been established with certainty, but uncertainty, once joined to secrecy, grows its own long shadow. And perhaps that is the deeper theme here. Not every silence is natural. Some are made larger by institutions, by caution, by war, by the instinct to close ranks when truth becomes inconvenient. Flight 739 vanished over open water, but it also disappeared into the fog of official language. In that sense, the mystery is not only about what happened in the sky, it is about what the living are permitted to know afterward, and how much of grief is shaped by the answers that never come. What if the final thing a pilot leaves behind is not wreckage, but a question? On an October evening in 1978, 20-year-old Frederick Valentich lifted off from Moorabbin Airport near Melbourne in a rented Cessna 182, bound for King Island across the Bass Strait. The route was familiar enough, the weather relatively calm, the aircraft small and uncomplicated by the standards of commercial aviation. It should have been the kind of private flight that disappears into routine, logged and forgotten among thousands of others. Instead, it became one of the most unsettling radio exchanges ever preserved. Not long into the flight, Valentich contacted air traffic control with an unusual report. Another aircraft, he said, appeared to be flying above him. At first, the description sounded merely uncertain, a shape with bright lights, moving in ways he could not easily classify. But as the minutes passed, his tone changed. The object seemed to circle. It passed overhead. It did not behave like a conventional plane. Valentich, who was young but not inexperienced, spoke with a kind of strained clarity that has troubled listeners for decades. He was not rambling. He was trying in real time to describe something he could not fit into known categories. Then came the sentence that still echoes, "It is not an aircraft." Moments later, the transmission ended in a strange metallic sound, part scrape, part vibration, impossible to identify with confidence. After that, silence. Search crews moved quickly over the Bass Strait, scanning water and shoreline for any sign of the Cessna. Nothing definitive was found. No complete wreckage, no body, no clean physical ending to match the intensity of those final words. Investigators later suggested that disorientation may have caused Valentich to become confused and spiral into the sea, perhaps mistaking his own lights or celestial reflections for another object. It is a rational possibility, but it does not settle the unease, because this case lives in the gap between explanation and experience. Witnesses on the ground reported unusual lights that night. Radar offered little help. Audio analysts could not agree on the final sound. And the pilot's voice itself remains the most haunting evidence, not because it proves anything extraordinary, but because it carries the unmistakable texture of a human being trying to stay calm while reality seems to slip sideways. Perhaps that is why the story endures. It is not only about whether Valentich saw something unusual, it is about how fragile our confidence becomes when description fails. We trust language to protect us, to turn fear into information, to make the unknown manageable. But sometimes all a person can do is point toward the dark and say, "Whatever this is, I do not recognize it." And sometimes that may be the last truth anyone gets. By now, the pattern is clear, though its meaning remains unsettled. Across oceans, mountain ranges, inland waters, and ordinary evening skies, these stories begin the same way, with departure. A manifest is checked, a route is filed, a machine built by human hands rises into air we have spent more than a century trying to master. And then, in a moment no one can fully predict, the familiar order of things gives way. A signal falters, a landmark is missed, a decision turns irreversible. Or else the evidence itself slips beyond reach, leaving behind a silence that no technology can entirely overcome. It is tempting to treat such disappearances as proof that the world is stranger than we imagined. And perhaps it is. But just as often, these stories tell us something quieter and more difficult. That knowledge has edges. We build instruments to extend our senses, procedures to contain risk, institutions to investigate failure, and narratives to make loss bearable. Most of the time, these systems work. They bring people home. They explain what happened. They allow grief to stand beside understanding. But not always. Sometimes the sky withholds. Sometimes the sea keeps the final record. Sometimes, even when answers come, they arrive years too late to soften the first wound. And yet these vanished flights endure in memory for more than their mystery. They endure because each one carried human lives in motion. People with habits, hopes, arguments, plans for dinner, unopened letters, private fears, and ordinary futures that did not know they were about to end. That is the moral weight beneath every legend. Not anomaly, but absence. Not spectacle, but interruption. When an aircraft disappears, what vanishes is not only a machine, it is a web of relationships, expectations, and stories that can never be completed in the way the living had imagined. Perhaps that is why we keep returning to these cases, not because we are drawn only to the unknown, but because the unknown exposes something essential about being human. We are creatures who search. We scan the horizon, reconstruct the past, listen again to damaged recordings, and ask one more question into the dark. We do this not merely to solve, but to honor. To say that uncertainty does not erase significance. To say that those who vanished are not reduced to a mystery, even if mystery is what remains around them. In the end, the sky is both a triumph and a reminder. It invites us upward across distance into possibility, but it also asks for humility. Every flight is an act of faith in systems, in people, in weather, in knowledge, in the fragile cooperation between intention and chance. Most of the time, that faith is justified. And when it is not, when a plane fails to arrive and the world must reckon with silence, we are left with the oldest human task of all, to keep looking, to keep remembering, and to accept that some truths live just beyond the edge of our reach. The question is not whether mystery will disappear from the world. It will not. The question is how gently, how honestly, and how humanely we learn to live beside it.